Welcome, everybody. I appreciate the support and coming out and having this fruitful conversation about language learning. My name is Femi. I'm a teacher educator based out of Minneapolis and soon in California. And I'm also the founder of Tangible Culture, which is a social justice organization that support educators on the ground around addressing identity-based violence and group-targeted harm. And we also do a lot of international education work, but wanted to really bring this conversation forward about social justice in world language classrooms. And the two people that came to mind was Thad and Lamar. So I'm super excited to have you both just share your perspectives about language learning from this social justice lens and also just access, right? Because we always talk about how students of color particularly are not represented as much in these language classrooms as well as study abroad. So starting with that, I would love for you both, if you can introduce yourself to the people who are in the room about your work and any fun facts about you that you think people should know. And whoever wants to start can go.
All right, that means me. Thanks, Lamar. That was smooth. Hi, everyone. I'm Thad Williams. I'm the program manager for world language and dual language and our international education programs here in Seattle Public Schools. I work pretty closely with about 10 schools. 5 of them are elementary, 3 middle school, and 2 to 3 high school. So I lied. It's probably more like 11 to 12. And then all of our world language teachers here in Seattle Public Schools. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, have lived in Seattle since 2008, where I was previously a high school teacher, a high school Spanish teacher, as well as a high school English language arts and multilingual teacher. I speak Spanish, which I learned throughout my life, and we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, in different ways today. And finished up PhD work at the University of Washington in language literacy and culture in 2018. And it's an honor to be in this conversation with Femi and Lamar today. So Lamar, I'll kick it to you next.
Perfect. I'm really sad that there's no reaction button. I feel like you're going to be saying a lot today that I wish I could heart and celebrate in the moment, Thad. So I'm going to figure out a way to physically represent that. Maybe I'll do a heart in the corner or something. I'm not.
I like to do this, so you can.
Oh, this. Okay. Yes. So this is what we're going to do. When I do this means yes. I agree. Okay, yeah, I'll introduce myself. What's up, everyone? My name is Lamar Shambley. I use he, him pronouns. I'm currently based in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and I am a high school Spanish teacher. I'm in my 10th year of teaching. 10 years is a really long time, but glad to be here for 10 years. So I'm a high school Spanish teacher, and I'm the founder and executive director of the nonprofit Teens of Color Abroad, also known as TOCA. We provide high school students of color with global language learning opportunities, and I'm sure I'll talk more about this later, but we do this in 2 ways. We have a virtual online language learning program where students are studying languages from refugee conversation partners dispersed throughout the world. And then this past summer, we launched our first in-person study abroad program, partnered with a school here in Brooklyn. No one in my family speaks another language. I didn't have a lot of friends when I was in school. So instead of gossiping with all of my other classmates, I just focused in Spanish classes where I could, there's dance, there's language, there's culture, there's community. It reminded me so much of home in New York. And I dove into studying Spanish when I was in middle school. Fast forward to college, I had the opportunity to study abroad in the Dominican Republic, where my academic professor sponsored my first passport and opened the world up to me. So it was because of him where I got to see the world and actually travel to the Dominican Republic. And then eventually my junior year, I studied abroad in Seville, Spain, where I got to continue to practice my Spanish. And all of those experiences led me to want to stand in front of kids who look like me, who come from my same neighborhood, and to get them excited about learning languages and connecting with people from across the world, and that there weren't many other Black folks in those experiences. So I'm super excited to share what I've learned so far being in the classroom, Spanish, also what I've learned in traveling, and also some of the great things we've got going on from TOCA. So really looking forward to learn from both of you in this conversation.
Thank you for that deep perspective about your work in education, both you and that. Also, if anybody in the audience, if you have a question that's come to mind, you want to respond to something or want to hear a response to a question, feel free to drop the question in the chat box and I will pose that question as well to create an open space for dialogue. So to begin, So that and Lamar. So as you was providing your background in terms of language teaching and administration, it's very clear that language learning has been an important aspect to your identity and in this journey of education. And so I would love to hear from you both. If you can start off by telling me and telling us, just when did you first notice a connection between social justice in language education, language learning? And of course, I will leave that up to you both to decide who wants to go first.
That's cool. I was ready to respond to this one first anyway. Yeah, I love this question. Thank you for posing this for me. When reflecting on this question, I thought back to my first year of teaching Spanish. And one of my favorite units to teach or themes is during Black History Month. So many of our students are thinking of Black History Month very much rooted in the United States. And so as a Spanish teacher, I get to zoom out a bit. And so usually I try to leverage during Black History Month, where students get to research famous and not so famous Afro-Latinas throughout history, where they get to see that intersection of being a descendant of African ancestry, but also being dispersed throughout the world, right? Especially in the Americas. And one of my favorite poems to teach is Me Gritaron Negra by Victoria Santa Cruz. She's a Peruvian poet, and she wrote this poem in 1978, basically about growing up in Peru, dark-skinned Black woman, and how people would call her negra and call her like Black. And so this poem, basically she's reaffirming her power in her dark skin and loving herself entirely. And I love teaching that because I think that's also a moment where a few students, in this case, there was one student in particular who was Latina, but also Black. And I think that she was really struggling with trying to describe her experience, her family experience, looking Black, but then growing up in a home where she was speaking Spanish. And this was one of the moments where teaching this poem, where this student in particular really recognized the power in her dark skin and embraced her Afro-Latinidad, and where she started to study the language around her ancestry and to even start to find stories, reaching out to her parents and her parents' parents to figure out exactly where her ancestors came from. And this all came from a Black History Month unit around Afro-Latinas throughout the world. And so that was one of the first times where I was like, this is important. It doesn't just have to be rooted in, we are going to learn the Spanish grammar, but actually we're going to look at some famous pieces of art and music throughout the Spanish-speaking world from Black folks. And I thought that was really important for my students to hear. I've primarily taught in low-income areas here in Brooklyn. And so I wanted our students to find power and find representation in Spanish class that was stepped away from language, but more on art and stories. And this student eventually went on to college at an HBCU, and she reached back out to me and told me just how thankful she was that she had learned that in Spanish class, because it's something that propelled her forward even now after high school. Finding that connection between Black history and also language, I think, was one of the first times where the idea of social justice in language education just really stood out to me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Lamar. And as I listen, it's always that balance of, oh, there's so many things I want to connect with, and but this is also about me highlighting experiences, and everyone listening can make the connections or not. But I think of three things when I think about this question, and it's rooted in much of my language learning experience, Spanish, as well as other kind of aspects of language learning, have been rooted in travel, academics, like my own student experience growing up through different levels of K+ education, and then teaching. And I think the first kind of point that comes to mind in terms of when I first noticed the connection between social justice and language education was 1998. I'm going to date myself a little bit, but I spent a lot of time in Central America. So I had the opportunity as a high schooler through some summer programming to go to Guatemala and spend time there. Also had some time to be in Honduras. And what became beautiful to me was the powerful vehicle that language is, not only just in communicating and all of that, but in terms of storytelling and who people are. And then when that's rooted in a movement that can stem towards social justice or understanding, instead of seeing things as a problem, as an opportunity to connect with different people. And so I think there was some early rooting and just travel opportunities that, as a high schooler at the time, I just was signing up for stuff and was encouraged by people to be this will help with your language. But it was far deeper than language, because it was ultimately opportunities to both see and experience what social justice begins to look like in different ways. that was particularly important for me as someone who identifies as a white male who, as I learned Spanish, it only further privileged like the identity I was inhabiting or living. And I think that's something that's important to just call out and recognize, because so many times in the United States context and maybe other contexts as well, when we see someone who identifies as a white person or is light skinned speaking another language, we really celebrate that. And it's, oh, isn't that so like great or whatever. And then there's many other language experiences that we view really as a deficit, or like, why isn't English being centered in that? And so that's really at the root of some things that I've tried to just grow in as a white educator, as well as lean into to say, if that is like the socio-linguistic context we're living in, what does that mean for students who are learning language, whether it's a student of color, a multilingual student of color, like whatever that might be. White kids learning language and need to recognize their privilege and what that means as they learn another language. Fast forward to 2007 to just wrap up this one. That was my first year teaching Liberty High School and in Tennessee. And I think there was a desire to keep the story short, but basically I was student teaching and the teacher never came back after one weekend. So I got the classroom and that's where I began. And if this was happy hour, I could go on for 2 more hours, but I'll keep it brief to there. But just to be real, like on that Monday morning, my goal was just like, how do I engage students? How do I like just get them to want to learn language? Or if they do want to learn that, what do we do here? And right away, it just became about what are the themes of interest to students. And I was in a high school that was predominantly African-American students, Black students, in a neighborhood where I grew up. Felt like a lot of excitement about being in this space and context, but also like, what am I doing as a Spanish 1 teacher that actually doesn't even really know what I'm doing right now? And it really just became about language more broadly than Spanish. So my goal was like, all of our language and languaging and all that's happening matters. And so words that a student shares that their grandmother says at the house is really valuable. Words that they hear in a song that is maybe coming from like a reggaeton background and doesn't fit the Castilian Spanish is really valuable. And so I just use some of those themes to prompt us to then asking questions about like language and power that I think are ultimately rooted in social justice and language education.
That's really powerful, for just even hearing you both talk about the importance of storytelling and that translanguaging aspect, because I even think about when I first learned French in middle school, being from Brooklyn, right? Growing up in this multicultural city. I'm from Canarsie, so that's an immigrant neighborhood. A lot of the people that I'm just sharing space with was coming from the Caribbean and largely Haiti. And I had a Haitian teacher who was teaching me French, but through this Haitian lens. And that was so radical. At least at the time, I didn't think it. I knew that there was something different about this type of French than the French that was normally taught, promoted, even throughout my high school and college years. And also just interacting with different enclaves in New York City and seeing this blend of Spanish and English and French and English and Creole, and seeing how rooted in that is so much of story and pain and isolation and love. And I too felt so called to that and really saw how within that, this was a story about justice and a story about resistance that is not oftentimes taught. And later in life, I saw something very different, because then when I went on to do French in college, of course, I had a professor who prioritized French from France and never really talked about Haitians or people from Martinique or Guadeloupe or French Caribbean, French West Africa, Central Africa. And so that's really powerful to hear, just like how social justice is rooted in the stories that we tell and how we learn it. And it's both that process and outcome when learning language, which then brings me to my next question. There's so much right now, especially in the United States, we talk a lot about language learning, and we know that within language learning, there's this elitism that exists, right? And it's also a control of language with power, with global currency. And so I would love to hear from you both, in the context of language education, right? Whether that's informal or informal, how do we elevate non-English languages with respect to the multitude of identities that exist within our community?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think it's already happening, right? Music is huge in this. All of my kids know who Blackpink is. All of my kids know who BTS is. They all read graphic novels. It's like an obsession now, right? And so even within that, them having a deeper love and appreciation for music and art, I was so curious and I asked students, how many of you know some phrases in Japanese? And they all raised their hand because they're like, yes, I know how to say hello. I know how to say thank you. I know how to say like short phrases that they had picked up just from their love of music and art. And so I think watching this K-pop explosion and this graphic novels explosion, I love it because I'm always just so interested in how a few of my students who might not have a big interest in Spanish, even though Spanish is everywhere in New York City, they are like drawn to Japanese and other East Asian languages. I think is really powerful and speaks to the importance of K-pop and graphic novel and every other thing that teenagers are falling in love with now. I was the same thing. When I was their age, of course, it was Spanish, right? Reggaeton blew up in the early 2000s. We seen in Yandel and Aventura. So of course I wanted to like, what are they talking about in this music and download it and look at the lyrics. And then I was then using some of those words in my AP Spanish essays. And so music, of course, is an excellent avenue to discover those other languages. And so I think music is an excellent power there. But then to your point earlier, and both you and Thad brought this up, is storytelling, the importance of sharing stories. Something that's really, I think is really dope whenever I see this in our TOCA online program. Because again, our students are studying these languages from refugees throughout the world. And so our students are learning these languages, but then they're also getting to connect with people to learn from their experience, to learn what's it like to flee Syria at an early age and then relocate to Jordan. What was it like in high school for you? Students asking just really earnest questions to get to know their teachers' lived experiences. And just through that and sharing stories and finding a common humanness, we've seen students like get really like more excited about picking up now this other language. They now have this human connection with someone else who speaks this language. And so they often want to pick up on it too. And so I think just one way or a few ways that we can continue to elevate non-dominant languages is just continue feeding kids music, some really good music in other languages. They take right to it. Kids, they may not even notice what they're saying, but they hear that beat and the beat is catchy. So that's what brings them in. And then you can just draw them in with actually translating what the lyrics mean, but then also getting to know people. Once you get to have a personal connection with someone who speaks another language, I think that will then encourage people to want to learn that other language.
Okay, I just love your response about music. And I feel like I should probably just be quiet and not actually answer this, but I'll give a brief piece only because you set me up around relationships. I think that's one of the big pieces. Like when I think about what does it look like to have concrete examples of elevating the status of non-dominant languages. Well, in a classroom, it means that when there's a relationship there and students who have some connection to other languages, non-dominant languages, they're positioned as having that rich depth of knowledge that their language and culture gives them. And that shouldn't be something we're putting the one student that speaks a certain language on blast in fifth period or whatever, but it is a way to be able to say like, how do we, in a language classroom, regardless of what the chosen language might be of that classroom, Spanish, French, Mandarin, whatever it might be, view that as a space, as I think many school and districts and spaces in the United States continually to become more multilingual and more diverse, that we just see there's a natural decentering of English going on. And so how do we celebrate that? How do we like integrate that? How do we systematically plan to make sure that is like where we're trying to go in terms of supporting educators with opportunities to just engage in learning, our own like language course planning, like things like that. But I think the relationships with students and with the communities also to think about what does it look like to continue to bring many languages into the school context, because that in and of itself helps with the decentering of English. And I think too, just being really strong about and explicit about the connections between language and identity, and that work can happen at any level. It doesn't require a certain proficiency for a student to reflect on like how language is impacting them and how they're showing up in that, or incredible travel opportunities, or even like you were saying, Lamar, I'm just dying to learn more about this connection with like how refugee students and experiences are being centered in a way to decenter English in some of the, I don't know, mainstream assumptions or bias or things that we often think about differences or whatever. Yeah, that's one thought about that. And one last thing, I think, I'm curious, and this might be just from where I'm at, and so people can give me feedback on this and I'll learn from it. But I also do feel like there is a decreasing pressure in some ways to prioritize English. So there's definitely plenty of pressure still to prioritize English, but I think there has been movement, and a lot of that is cultural, to point to Lamar's example of music, which I think is power.
Yeah, I definitely think that globalization has influenced how we prioritize language, especially because like when I was teaching ESL, so many of my students they were coming from Mexico, right? In Minneapolis, in Ecuador, and they were interested in Afro beats because of how similar the beats were to things like dancehall, to reggaeton. And so for them, it developed a natural curiosity to want to learn about the culture, African culture, specifically in West Africa, where a lot of Afro beats is like happening at. And that's also influenced by music in the Caribbean, both coming from Latin America and South America, as well as Central and the Caribbean. And so I do think that globalization play a major role in that. And yet I still see that when we talk about languages too, like we don't even look at how indigenous language is an international and a global language that needs to be elevated. And I've seen it happen policy-wise in Minneapolis with the Lakota and Dakota language, specifically Ojibwe, but that's still a slow progress, right? And then when you look at it from that international lens, so much of the emphasis is on learn English and then sacrifice everything else, because that's the language that's going to give you the upward mobility. And that's still part of that freedom dreaming we need to do. To quote Bettina Love of abolitionist work, is working towards decolonizing education and land in this way that honors the ancestral legacy and cultural legacies of our students. Still holding on to that. Still holding on to that. But while we are talking about globalization and language and elevating non-dominant language, there's still this pressing need to make language learning accessible, especially for BIPOC students. And we all have seen, even I'm pretty sure that, and Lamar yourself seen that data, that Black students are underrepresented, and that number has been stagnant. Same from Asians as well as Latinx students. And so I would love to hear from you both and your own work, something that you probably haven't even thought about and now thinking about it. In what ways are you creating space, or what advice do you have for people who are working in language education, who are trying to create space and access for BIPOC students who are historically underrepresented in this type of education, world language education specifically?
I can jump on that, Lamar, with one idea. I think a lot about this. I don't think it's like it's maybe the start to an answer or response. And I would love, like, for Student Voice to ultimately, I guess, finish this response in some way. But I think a lot about, it's about students seeing themselves in that. And that's where I sometimes wonder when I'm in a Spanish 1 or 2 class, or we have some great partners in the Seattle area that we've worked with to support language course offerings of a wide variety, as well as even some things around travel and things like that. If a student is hearing that from a presentation, if they're seeing that from a flyer, if they're seeing that on some of their social media outlets, do they see themselves in that? This could be me. And not that it's going to look like the exact experience it's being told, but that can be a part of their story in terms of the travel, or in terms of being bilingual or multilingual, or that. So I think I'll stop there, but I think that's something I want to learn more about and I want to know more about is when I sit down with students and particularly Black students here in Seattle Public Schools at Chief Sealth or at Rainier Beach or at Franklin or Cleveland, Ingram, Nathan Hale, whatever school they might be at. I want to know, like, where do you see yourself based on the identities that you are and that you're becoming? And what are the opportunities that can then just foster that or cultivate that?
Yeah, that's your point of like students seeing themselves in the programs, in the work. I think that's number one. When I started TOCA, I wanted to be very intentional about centering students of color, especially Black students, because I had seen behind the scenes or going to other programs' websites and et cetera, that they weren't being centered. They were like a footnote, but it wasn't the first thing that you saw. And so that's why I wanted to be intentional about that and even name our organization Teens of Color Abroad. So there is no elephant in the room. It's no, just put it out there and have that be the beginning of a conversation. Why did you name it this? Let's go ahead and look at the data, right? And relate it all to that. And so I wanted to center students of color, especially Black students, in order to show them that you are involved in this, your voice matters. I think another way to make language education more accessible, I'm thinking about my own adolescence. I'm very much a millennial who grew up in chat rooms. I used to always be in chat rooms, like practicing my Spanish, hoping to find someone who would also want to practice their Spanish with me or that spoke Spanish. And so that was that like almost human friend connection across languages that made it just so much more exciting. And so I see technology, of course, as a really easy platform to use to make language learning more accessible. Something that we're doing with TOCA actually in a few weeks, Femi, thank you for your support with this, is doing these virtual cultural exchange sessions where students get to meet other students from other parts of the world and where they get to practice English and Spanish. But more importantly, having students get to learn about what their peers' lives are like in a different part of the world. I think that sort of opens their mind to what is possible, but also what do they have in common with students from different parts of the world? But that also gets them to learn about some Spanish or maybe even some other aspects of language that they don't get to learn in a classroom. There's only so much that I can do in a classroom in teaching Castilian Spanish, right? But when you have that friend that could teach you a little bit more about some words, some verbs, even some like grammar rules that you're not learning in class, I think is really powerful. And something else, and actually this is a friend from college, he created a platform called Pangea Chat. And Pangea Chat is really cool because you get to learn a language while you're texting with your friends. So in the middle of texting, you can tap what you've sent and it will immediately translate it in the moment. And so you get to learn a language while texting, and conversation is the best way to learn, right? You have to be fully immersed in it. You have to be into it. And so I think that's an excellent new skill, or excuse me, a new tech platform that I really want to use in the classroom. And yeah, I think just technology, connections with people, and having these virtual cultural exchange sessions could really push students who maybe don't see themselves in language education to jump right into it.
I wrote Pangea down. I was like, I never heard of Pangea. I love new technology. I'm always suggesting it to people because I use a lot of technology in my own learning spaces, but I'm facilitating or just learning. But I do think technology is an important aspect to facilitate learning and also to make it accessible to students, especially because everybody is on the phone. They on that little thing that's in their hand, right? And so we have access to it all the time. And so a little can take us a long and far way. I would love to hear from you both about this. So we know that we talked a little bit about globalization and exposing students to at least getting them to learn about new ideas and concepts and language, right? And so with that also comes controversy. And we know like language is this neutral space where oftentimes, at least in my experience, I've never had a teacher that addressed controversy through language. And we're talking about BLM, gender neutral language when it comes to Spanish, French as well. That's been a push in France. And so I would love to hear, like, how do you respond to controversy from this language lens, especially when there's so much nuances around it, both in the US, across regions, and internationally?
I have a simplistic answer, but it's meant to just be like maybe more humorous, even though I'm not sure it's funny, but I think we invite it. But I also want to say that with the caveat of the context in which you are making sense of this controversy and have space to make sense of it and ask questions and what are the critical lenses we can place on it is sort of what goes behind that invitation. Because I think language in the experiences I have observed and tried to shape into how I think about language in all forms, define that in so many different ways and very loosely and fluidly, is really power. So it's actually not neutral at all because it's often tied to why the controversy, whatever it might be, becomes, because it's rooted in an identity of race potentially, or gender, or many different identities, but is the expression. And so that could be coming from an individual or a collective group. But I think how we understand that as a point of like an attribute of what that group is expressing is important. But I also think in the same way, language is used in so many ways to harm people. It's been used to harm entire communities. It's been in of itself can be eradicated, and so it's like there's these controversies that swirl around language, but I don't think it's as simple as something that can get written off as neutral, or we should avoid the controversy within language in order to just stick to how language is interpreted by linguists, because even in that, it's like sociolinguist or psycholinguist, because that's a really different thing. Yeah, I think we have to invite it into our spaces at the sort of with the critical lens we take it on, and that hopefully as educators, we can support students and grow with students, and like, what are those critical lenses and questions we're asking, or what are those their own identities that they're bringing that is that critical piece. It's not actually a lens, it's just who kids might be or who educators might be.
Yeah, when I thought of the word controversy, I thought of just like a few different things. The first is actually, Thad, you just brought it up, but using language to uplift and support people. For me as a Spanish language teacher, of course, the first thing I thought about was immigration, and how I often say this, learning another language builds cultural empathy and community building. Chances are, if you learn another language, you are more likely to express support and empathy for people from different backgrounds than your own. And something that I often do in class, because again, growing up in New York City, I ask my students, raise your hand if you've ever been approached by someone needing directions to somewhere in the city in Spanish. And they all raise their hands. And so it's like, yes, that's not uncommon here in New York City to be approached by someone who speaks Spanish. What can we do now that we're in Spanish class? How can we take what we're learning to help the people in our communities, right? Now we need to take this outside of the classroom. And I think once students start to see what we're learning in the classroom is not just stuck within these four walls, but that they can actually take it out and do something with it, either to connect with other people, to help other people. I think that is really powerful. And that's what you were saying earlier, just like using language to support folks who are often marginalized because of political reasons, I think is something really important. And also, Femi, you brought this up earlier, just talking about like gender expansive language. And of course, gender could be considered controversy. It's not controversial to me. I know that gender is so expansive. There's not this binary, but of course, in the Spanish language, we have very binary, masculine or feminine sort of language. And so something that I love to do in class to bring up and to get at least kids thinking about why language is the way that it is and how maybe it needs to change. So I have 6 sisters and 1 brother. And so, of course, in Spanish, when I'm talking about my siblings, I say mis hermanos, and my students are just so confused. They're like, wait, but you have 6 sisters. Why would you say hermanos when you only have 1 brother? And then a lot of the girls in the class are just starting to think, wait, why are we being erased from this because there's 1 boy, right? And so just getting students to like, why do languages function the way that they do, and why have they functioned for so long in favor of men, I think is something I like to get my students thinking about.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Introducing something as simple as that and having students do that critical inquiry, right? About like why we are excluded from this conversation, I think is a really great way to start that. And I really love that piece about immigration, especially because I think that a lot of times people try to move away from the topic of immigration or don't see themselves in that issue. And so when you bring that forth, especially about how I've seen it in language classrooms and how I did it, and just connecting the lived experiences of people in Ecuador when I lived there to the lived experiences in the United States, and seeing how these two things are similar, if not the same, right? And having discussions about that through this English, right? English class in this English classroom, enrich their own perspective about the issues that's happening in their own country, and seeing that this is not just an endemic to Ecuador. And so I really do appreciate that aspect of it. And speaking of power, I think that parents is really important in all of this. And I know when it comes to language learning, when it comes to talking about gender expansive languages, right? In Spanish and French, or even in indigenous language, or even education abroad, parents are always at the forefront of that conversation, whether they agree with it or they are rejecting it. And so I would love to hear about how can you get parents involved in this type of conversation? Because we see it now, right? With the banning in schools, you can't talk about this and not even apply to language, right? But getting them to understand creating a humanizing space is important. And so I would love to hear from you all about the ways in which you are engaging parents in language learning, about content, if that came across, especially parents of color who have a lot of anxiety about education abroad, or getting their students to learn something that probably might not be useful.
Yeah. Parents. I actually love parents. I love talking with parents. I think when we did our first study abroad program this past summer, it was so beautiful to get to know the parents because it made me understand their children so much more. I was almost disappointed in myself for waiting until the end of the school year. Yeah, now I understand your child so much more. But also, I mean that in the way of I would meet parents and get their excitement of learning. Oh, you're the Spanish teacher? Oh my God, thank you. I've been trying to tell my child how important it is to learn this other language. And it's, oh yes, this is why your child works so hard in Spanish class, because that's driven into them at home. That language is powerful. So many parents that I've spoken to, one, are like, okay, so Mr. Shambley, where are you from? Where? I'm like, I'm from Brooklyn. They're like, okay, but where are your parents from? I'm like, my parents are also from Brooklyn. And so they're like, but you teach me. And so right there in that moment, I get to break this stereotype that you must be of a certain race or a certain culture to speak a language. And I know I'm a grown adult, but I started really getting into Spanish when I was 13, when I was 14 years old, when I was their children's age. And so I get to, from the get-go, say, hey, I was in your child's shoes. I picked up on it. Now I teach Spanish because of my experiences. And so I get to live in this skin where I can knock down those stereotypes. But also, I think a lot of parents understand now that they're adults, they're like, man, I wish I paid attention in Spanish classes. That's the second thing that I hear. You don't know how lucky you are. Now that they're adults, they see how important this language is and they hear it everywhere. And so I think a lot of parents know the power of it. They just don't know how to reinforce it at home. But I do think it's incredible for students to hear their parents explain the power of learning another language. And I think it's just like having that conversation with the student and the parent there. And something else that I was thinking of, I had a student last year who finally revealed in April, towards the end of the year, that he spoke 4 languages. Didn't bring it up the entire school year. I honestly don't think that he thought about it, because this is a language that he mostly uses at home. He didn't realize how powerful it is that he spoke Wolof at home. And I'm like, you speak what? Why don't you tell your classmates? And he just didn't. He's like, I don't know. I didn't think it was important. And so I think it's like encouraging students and parents to like understand the power of speaking these multiple languages, whether it's just at home. This is something that they can take to school and take to their classmates. So I think it's just getting them also to understand the power of being multicultural and being multilingual at home.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add, like coming from a larger district, has been definitely when there's opportunities to engage parents directly through classroom educators or through school structures, yes. And we have tried to have long-term meaningful relationships with community partners who sometimes represent different languages and are multilingual, sometimes don't, but have a keen interest in really promoting language learning, travel opportunities, things like that, and really then trying to connect with specific families of student groups that we really want to promote language learning and travel for. And so like in Seattle, that is our Black families, and trying to figure out like, hey, what's the level of interest, but also here's the menu of options and opportunities that we want to do with. And so I think a few community partners in South Seattle area have been really helpful in trying to have those conversations with parents, but also being a trusted space for some of our families to go to. And sometimes you're in a larger district and there's issues of trust and harm because of the institution, and not by any means using the partnership, but trying to look around in your local context and figure out like, who are community organizations and groups and people that we can get to know each other, figure out what each other's purposes are, and then say, hey, can we partner on this and do that work?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective, because I know that the fear, especially with teachers these days, is about the involvement, or at least the harmful practices that are put forth by parents. And I've been in part of conversations as of lately when it came to world language classrooms about involving parents, and especially around these topics, but also getting them interested, to at least getting their support to get their students interested and enrolled in language classes and education abroad. We have some questions. One question that I'm seeing: so what resources or trainings do you suggest for world language teachers who are newer to the US or who are less familiar with US-based social justice topics? How do you get them involved or get them on board to shift their curricula in these ways, especially if they are still building their English proficiency and maybe overwhelmed by US-based social justice terminologies and concepts?
I think there's like multiple responses flooding my brain right now, but I think one is when you are in a new context, newer to the United States as an educator, the process of both like doing the individual identity work to just think about what are differences between my own language experiences growing up and like where I'm at now. And that can happen a lot of different ways. But I think it has to be rooted in kind of an understanding. I'm not saying go out and buy a ton of books and read them, because we don't have that much time as educators often. Like, we love to read, I know, we love to get those books, but I think it's more of just as you talk with other educators in the building, or as you're an educator talking with other folks in the building or in the community, like how do you identify what are some of the key historical experiences and events that have happened that are rooted in social justice, and from whose perspective have those been told, and how do you lean into that more? Because I think like anytime you're in a newer city or space, like sure, there's going to be a dominant narrative of what the social justice based topics are, but that might be just like 10% of it. And I wonder, is there a way to respectfully leverage students around that? I don't know, maybe not. Is there a way to collaborate and connect with other educators who might understand that and speed up that learning curve? But I think that's one thing that comes to mind in terms of just the like day-to-day outside of different trainings and things that I guess could be recommended.
Yeah, Thad, I agree with you 100%. I was going to say collaboration with local with similarly minded educators, and also just thinking of moving to the US, if there are any educators from originally where's home for you, or if there are universities from that country, if there's any way you could access any sort of readings that they have, I think could be immensely helpful. But definitely collaboration and willingness to listen. I think that like I've learned a lot about social justice from other people and listening to their experiences and what they've gone through, and then relying on readings. So I think just like finding other people, but then also reaching out to universities and even some other educators that could maybe point you out to the right direction for readings if you want to get into the academic side of things.
And Femi, I was going to add one more point. It just came
go
to me
ahead.
as Lamar was speaking. I think like asking the question that was just raised is important, whether that's as a single educator or as a department at the school or in the district or wherever you might be, because like what are the local social justice topics or issues that we're trying to get at in our curriculum? Because so often many curricula that I've seen are going to set you up with some really nice surface level cultural introductions to things, but they're probably not going to be localized in a way, even to the US context, where some of the bigger social justice topics like immigration, or even like currently as we're thinking about like gender and language, like what does that mean? And how are students experiencing that? How are educators experiencing that? So I think just asking the question also is a really important start, and then seeking out to say, how are we answering this in our units and our planning and our collaboration?
This question reminds me of just how vulnerable it is. Like teaching is a vulnerable practice. And I think when I hear this, I'm hearing about this kind of this developmental phase, right? Or model that we need to employ when we're working with teachers who don't oftentimes understand, especially if they're not from like the US, don't really understand social justice concepts. I think it's important to meet them where they are at, try to figure out where the gap of knowledge is happening, and seeing how you can plug that in. And oftentimes I think that the best way is to do that is to have them teach about social justice concepts that they are familiar with, and that can be from their own country. For an example, I think immigration is a very easy target to talk about because a lot of people are impacted by that. Or climate change, right? We are all impacted by climate change, or climate crisis, I should say, or economic injustice. And so if we can connect I like to say, localize the global and globalize the local, that is a really great way in supporting educators who are not familiar with US-based social justice terminology, or at least politics and how that inner political system works. Have them operate from their own cultural lens that allows them to passionately speak about the lived experiences of people from their own country in the target language that students are learning, in the target language that they are teaching in. And I think in that way, supporting them on the English proficiency aspect of things as well, to help them like develop those ideas and that praxis in order to successfully teach those concepts in the classroom. And so that's something I was thinking about, just taking that intercultural and developmental approach if they don't know about it, and helping them move along that continuum to really increase their competency interculturally as well as politically. So that's something I was thinking about. We have another question. On the topic of girls being erased with one male noun, how do you address your students about the standard learning to make them feel included without lowering or possibly seeming disrespectful to the old language/culture?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so the topic related to, and Lamar, I think this is more about when we talked about, when we talked about gender expansive languages, how do you address students about standard learning? So I'm assuming the way I'm interpreting this, just the way languages are taught without the social justice concepts like gender expansive, to make them feel included without lowering or possibly seeming disrespectful to the old language and culture. So it just seems like this duality.
Yeah. As a language educator, I need to teach the curriculum, right? So it's important that I teach, here's how the language works. Here's how you will, me saying, yo tengo 7 hermanos. If I go anywhere in the Spanish speaking world, they will understand what I'm saying. And then I say the names of my siblings and they can figure it out. So it's important that I start like with what needs to be taught. But then on top of it, let them know, here's also what you're going to see, especially introducing X, because they've seen so much of that, but don't really know what it means. So I often ask, raise your hand if you've ever heard the term or seen the term Latinx. And then from there, explain what that means so that they at least, oh, okay, so now when I see Latinx, I know that this is gender expansive. Or if I see Latine, this is gender expansive language. And what I've noticed is students, especially students that have gender nonconforming people in their community, these are the words that they're like, okay, this is the word I want to be cognizant to use because this best represents my situation and the people around me. I will say sometimes I struggle with that because I will often immediately go to the gender expansive, and my students who speak Spanish at home are like, why'd you say juntes and not juntos? And I'm like, oh, sorry, I probably confused you there. And so I try to make it seem like I'm teaching you this because this is how this language is developing to include everyone, but then also just to make it clear from the very beginning that this is how language is taught. So I guess it's showing them both ways and letting them choose.
I think those examples are really helpful, Lamar. And I think the only thing I would add is like how to just push kids to understand, or all of us to understand, language is fluid. So it's evolving, it's changing over time, and how we observe that and make sense of that. And particularly when it's tied to like decentering certain power structures or certain old language hierarchies is great. And we can still do that and still meet standards and follow curriculum and teach language to a really high level of communication and interaction that is applicable in the end.
Thank you both. I really love those responses. And on that note, I would love to thank everyone for coming out and supporting and really listening to some dope people talk about languaging and social justice in the world language world. If people want to connect with you outside of this space, where can they find you?
I am on LinkedIn. That is probably one of the most visible spaces you can find me, as well as happy to be a little bit old school and drop my email in here if you want to connect directly. I'm always willing to do email.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. Definitely, I use LinkedIn a lot, so you can look up Lamar Shambley. I am the only Lamar Shambley in the entire world. No one else has my name. The Lamar Shambley, but also the nonprofit Teens of Color Abroad. We are on Instagram at Teens of Color Abroad. We are also on LinkedIn at Teens of Color Abroad and on TikTok on Teens of Color Abroad. So feel free to connect with me there.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Lamar, Thad, thank you for coming today. And to everybody else, thank you for showing up and participating and listening to some dope people.